Alrighty, beautiful strong people, Coach Alan here, and welcome to Squat Weak Points Analysis. In this lesson, we're going to try and understand why there are certain breakdowns in the squat and how to go about actually fixing them. Because once we actually understand why a certain compensation is actually happening in the squat, it's going to be easier for us to kind of isolate the tools that we should be using in fixing the squat. So first of all, one particular thing that we should be understanding when we're talking about squatting and when we're talking about any kind of movement in general is your body is very biased to survival. It doesn't really care about perfect technique. Because compensations can actually happen because you're trying to force certain positions in which your body is just not meant to be in, such as trying to squat as upright as possible while your body is just not built for it. Maybe you have like really long femurs, really long torso, and because of that, you just cannot, sit upright. Or there can be some circumstances in which your body just doesn't really have strong enough tissues for certain loads, so it has to kind of compensate with some other loads, taking the responsibility of actually finishing the lift. So your body doesn't really care about how pretty a squat really is. It really cares about survival, because if it finishes the task, it's going to survive, and if it's going to survive, obviously there will be more chances of reproducing and passing on your genes and so on. So that's how we have to understand from a principle perspective the breakdowns. The compensations are just ways in which your body kind of redistributes load so it can actually finish the task. Unfortunately, we cannot really beat your CNS efficiency, voluntarily speaking. So you cannot cue yourself out of a weak point. You cannot cue yourself out of, finding a better way of actually doing the movement. You just have to, adapt, first of all, the technique to your build. And you also have to get the tissues and the positions in which your body is finding itself weak to get better at squatting. So your CNS has a little bit more faith in using those tissues into those positions, because your body will always lean on using the stronger tissues for one particular movement. If it doesn't have faith, for example, in one particular movement, it's going to shift away from it and is going to dump the load in some other tissues. So when we're trying to identify a weak link, we have to identify not what's taking over, what's actually breaking down, but more so the tissues that are actually escaping the load. And in understanding this, we have to get into some very basic, let's say, physics. And, I'm not going to dive too deep into it, but we're going to learn about moment arms, because those moment arms are going to determine how much a tissue is going to work. Think of moment arm as how far the weight is trying to pull a joint out of position. Okay, the farther the bar is from the joint, the harder the muscles around that joint is going to work. Okay, so in a squat, if the bar is farther from the hips, obviously the hips and the back, this whole area is going to work harder than the knee is really going to work. Okay, so in this example, we kind of have a long femur individual that's doing a low bar squat, and this is more so related to what's actually happening at the bottom of a squat, because these leverages are going to change depending on the positions in which your body is actually going to find itself. So the hip moment arm and the knee moment arm is pretty much null when you're in a upright position before going down into descent. But as you're going through the descent, the hip moment arm and the knee moment arm starts to actually lengthen, and the most length that you're actually going to find is going to be when you're going to reach the bottom. So that's also where you may potentially change those leverages based on what can actually take the load and what cannot take the load. So as an example, if we had to take this individual, this long femur individual, and turn him into a short femur individual, we're going to see the mechanics very different. So we're going to see him be a little bit more upright, as an example, and have a longer knee moment arm than it is right here. Maybe not as long as the hip moment arm in that circumstance, but maybe have a little bit of more of a symmetrical, let's say, moment arm in between the hip and the knee moment arm. And that's going to mean that your quads will have as much load as the hips are actually going to have in that particular position. But we should be putting the question, why exactly a long femur individual cannot squat like a short femur individual? What's actually going on in there? And the most important thing that we should be taking under account is balance, because your body is manipulating positions based on balance. It's going to change the position so it actually meets the required balance to actually induce that force production. So any compensation that actually happens in the squat is going to be related to balance in the first place. Okay, the body will always sacrifice position before sacrificing balance. And let's take the individual that we just described, the long femur individual, and put him through different variations. Okay, so for example, in front squat, in a high bar squat, in a low bar squat, okay, we're going to see the mechanics of the movement a little bit different. We're going to see the positions of the hips and the knees a little bit more versatile. So for example, when you're doing a front squat, you're going to have less hip moment arm and a little bit more of a knee moment arm. When you're going to do a high bar squat, you're going to have, a little bit less knee moment arm, and that hip moment arm is going to start to increase. And when you're going to do a low bar squat, the knee moment arm is going to decrease and the hip moment arm is going to increase. So that's how it actually changes. But in these positions, you're going to notice that there is one particular thing that doesn't change, and that is the bar being over midfoot. That is your center of mass. The barbell and the body is actually moving as one system. The bar actually becomes like an annex of you. So the center of mass must stay over the midfoot. So your joints have leverage to actually contract. That leverage again is going to change based on the mechanics of the movement, based on your anthropometry, and based on where the bar is actually being placed. When you move the barbell a little bit closer to the midline, obviously is going to shift that load a little bit more forward, and because of that you're going to have more of a knee moment arm. So that's how we have to understand compensations. Compensations happen because there is a risk of actually losing balance, because one of the tissues may potentially not be strong enough to take the load, so your body has to compensate that with some stronger tissues. So don't look at what moved in a squat, look at what actually escaped, what tried to actually escape the load. Once we actually do that, we can easily identify the weak point, because after all, that is the weak point. It is not what's breaking down. Usually what's actually breaking down is the tissue that is strong enough to actually take the load. Where the weak point really is where the weight is actually escaping. Okay, so which joint or which tissue is trying to escape from its responsibility to actually shorten. If it actually lengthens, it means that it loses leverage, and it means that the weight is actually being dumped more in there. If it actually shortens, that means that that tissue is actually doing its job. So it actually continues to do its job. So, it actually finishes it. If in one particular, that joint that should shorten cannot really shorten because it doesn't really have the juice or the power, what's going to happen? The other joints or the other tissues are actually going to lengthen, so that joint can actually shorten and finish off the lift. So we're going to dive into some breakdowns, and we're going to have a few examples of breakdowns. We're going to try and analyze and see why there are certain compensations and what's actually happening in there. Okay, so we have the first breakdown, which is going to be the chest falls forward out of the hole. Okay, so just out of the hole, what's happening is the hip moment arm is being increased in relation to the knee moment arm. So if I was to actually draw like a line in here over the barbell, over the midfoot, we can actually see that the hip moment arm is actually increasing, while the knee moment arm is actually getting a little bit closer to the middle. Obviously, this is not, a straight line, but, it's close to a straight line in here. So what's actually happening in here, the demands of the hip extension increases, while the demands of the knee extension decreases. So with that, a lot of people will say that this is like a back problem. Your back just cannot really sustain the weight, which in some circumstances can actually be true, but it's more so like the back rounding and the chest falling forward. That's more so the result of the problem. It's not the problem itself. The problem is your ability to actually generate force from this knee extension. And this can happen, again, this can happen either you trying to force one particular position in which your body is not, meant to be in. It's just not fit. That technique is just not fit for your body mechanics, or it is fit for your body mechanics, but that tissue is just not strong enough to actually get out of that position. So for example, if you are a long femur individual and you're trying to squat very upright, what's going to happen is that the knees are going to shift very forward. You're going to shift your center of mass pretty far back, and as a result the weight has to be distributed back to the midfoot. So what's going to happen, you're going to have your hips shooting back, so it kind of gets you into that leaned forward position so you can actually finish off the lift. So it's kind of getting you, when you reach the bottom, your body is reorganizing the leverages so it can actually get you into that position. So the way we're going to conceptualize this so we understand it a little bit better is going to be what is escaping the load and what is taking over, and why does that happen. Okay, so obviously what's escaping the load are going to be the quads. In some circumstances, especially in deflection as to grass, you're also going to have a adductor weakness in there. And what's going to take over is going to be pretty much your posterior chain. So glutes, spinal erectors, hamstrings, those are the tissues that are going to take over this particular movement. So you can finish the lift. So the body no longer trusts that deep knee flexion force production. So it shifts that back to the hip extensors. Now, if we want to look for some variations or some builders that really address this issue, we should be looking at variations that help us have more knee moment up. Okay, so for example, front squats, high bar pose squats, hack squats, and heel elevated squats are great tools to really help with this issue. Okay, the front squats, because you're kind of shifting that barbell, you're moving it in front, so you're creating more knee moment arm. The high bar squat with the pause especially is going to help you to really get more fine-tuned in connecting with proprioceptively feeling your quads a little bit more, so you can actually generate force out of the bottom more coming from the quads. Is going to give you, with that pause, and you do want that pause to be like 2 to 3 seconds, not just a split of a second, but enough to really help you control your torso position, check whether or not you're actually balanced or not, and really press against the floor. The hack squat, because it directly overloads the quads without any balance limitation, so you can really target your quads with a hack squat while being, having that stability component addressed. And heel elevated squats, either if you're, let's say a flat shoe squatter and you're changing to a heel elevated shoe, or you can also add like a little bit of a heel elevation with a slight platform, or even have like a plate underneath your heel, so you create a little bit more quad drive, a little bit more knee drive forward, and that's going to obviously demand more quad out of the movement. Now, as loading parameters, you're going to have some ideas in here. You can pause the video so you can take these as examples. I'm not going to dive too deep into this because this is going to be a long lesson, so I do not want to spend 2 hours to actually finish it. But as loading, anywhere around 3 to 5 sets, 3 to 6 repetitions. On the more hypertrophic side, such as the hack squat and the heel elevated squat, you can go at higher repetitions. You can push these a little bit harder in terms of reps in reserve. For the high bar squat, you need at least a 2 to 4, even 4 second pause in there. So you're actually demanding that stability component at the bottom. In terms of percentages, 70 to 82% for the front squat and 60 to 75% of your 1 rep max on the high bar pause squat. So as accessories, obviously we need to target quads. So how do we do that? Well, leg extensions on the machines, reverse Nordics, step ups, pretty much any kind of variation of step up is going to be a good tool in there, because it's really going to teach you how to use that knee control. Is going to connect you with what you should be proprioceptively feeling to connect with your quads and really have more pop out of the quads. And the bell squat is very versatile in the sense that you're pretty much doing a squat, but it's not, you're not having the bar loaded on your back. You're actually having that, let's say, load connected to your hips. So you have the ability to pretty much mimic the squat, but change to some degree a bit the stance, or change the orientation of your feet so you can get as much quad drive as possible in there. Now, moving on, Another breakdown that is very similar to this, but there is a small caveat to it, is hip shooting back at midpoint. So just over parallel, we start to see that dumping of the weight forward. Now, this is not as much a quad issue as much as it actually becomes a hip issue, because your body cannot really transition properly the force coming from the quads to the hips. So when you're actually reaching the midpoint, your pelvis, your hips more so as a joint, just doesn't really have the juice to really finish off the movement. So what's going to happen is going to dump the weight forward. So that is shifted from the hips, it's actually being shifted to your lumbar, to your erectors, and so on. So it's a compensatory manner to, your glutes just not really having the juice to finish off the lift. So what is escaping the load is going to be the glutes. In some circumstance can also be adductors, and it's actually being taken over by the spinal erectors and lower back. And this happens because you cannot smoothly transfer force production from the quads to the hips. So your body has to kind of change the torso mechanics so it can actually get into a position which it can finish off the movement. Again, survival instinct. This is not about being pretty. This is about, being able to reproduce and pass on your genes. So as variations, if we are looking for some variations, we have to look for some variations that either help us to target the glutes directly into that hip thrust motion, or a synchronicity in between the quads and glutes into the movement. So exercises such as safety bar squat, because it actually increases the torso demand while requiring sustained hip extension. The good mornings, because it directly overlaps hip extensions and spinal erectors. The Hatfield squat, an excellent variation with this one, because it actually allows overload through that transition zone with stability support. So you can pretty much hold the handles on the Hatfield squat and really power through with your hips to actually finish off the movement. If you need extra stability or you need an extra oomph to actually get out of that transition zone, you can use your hands to actually pull it back and push through with your hips. And wide stance post squats, wide stance because it's going to challenge your adductors, but it's also going to challenge your glutes. It's going to take less, let's say, involvement coming from the quads. So a lot of this movement is actually going to come through your hips. So it's going to not only help with the adductor contribution, but also with your glute contribution into the movement. As loading, again, anywhere around 3 to 5 sets, 3 to 6 repetitions, anywhere around 70 to 80% of your 1 rep max. Good mornings at Hatfields can actually be pushed even further than 8 repetitions. Good mornings, I actually really like to do them more so. If I really want to get heavy, I can definitely go to like 6 repetitions. But if I want to teach that movement and give my body the opportunity, and to my athletes the opportunity to really teach the movement of actually hinging back while being loaded with the bar on your back, I would actually do more repetitions. So that's more so endurance, but it also has a component of actually teaching the movement that you should be finding yourself into when you're finishing off the squat. As accessories, again, target the glutes or the synchronicity between the glutes and the quads. Romanian deadlifts, 45-degree back extensions, adductor machine because it directly targets the adductors, and split squats with a little bit of a torso lean because it also trains the unilateral hip force production. So moving on to the next breakdown, which is going to be the valgus collapse or the knees caving in. This is not so much of a big deal if it's subtle. So as long as you're keeping the center of mass control, as long as your feet do not slip inwards, so you're losing that contact with the floor, it shouldn't be much of a big problem. For example, you should avoid being in this position, but if there is just a slight, caving in, and the barbell is relatively fluent from down to all the way to actually finishing the lift, you should be fine. But what's actually happening is your body just doesn't really trust this position, just doesn't really trust the external rotation, and it doesn't really trust the abduction in this particular position. So it kind of has to compensate that by using the by using the adductors. This can also be an issue regarding the foot position, so maybe not really being connected with your feet, or not having your feet turned in such a manner which it actually allows you to use your let's say external rotators, and because of that the knee is actually caving in. This can also be a cause related to you trying to kind of force yourself into a wider position, a wide stance position, while your pelvis doesn't really, allow that. You do not have the possibility to actually generate force through that wide stance position. So because of that, the challenge is that you do not have the juice to actually get out of the bottom. So your adductors have to kind of take over. So what's actually escaping the load? Again, the hip stabilizers, external rotations, the stability of your foot, in some circumstances, the glute max. What's actually taking over is going to be the adductors. So why does this happen? Well, your body just doesn't really trust the external rotation control. So it actually searches for external leverage. So it has to internally rotate, shift pressure medially, so it can actually finish off the movement and obviously, survive. As variations, if we're actually looking for some variations, tempo squat, because you have a lot of time under tension to really connect with your foot, with your tripod foot. So heel, big toe, small toe, and really drive through that force is going to help you to actually connect with your adductors and abductors, with your lateral hip stability. And once you're actually reaching the bottom, being able to utilize those tissues a little bit better. The pause squat, because it actually builds stability in the flexion. And again, you do not want to pause just for a split of a second. You want to sit into that position for long enough. So 2 to 3 seconds is going to be a good way to actually train this particular thing. Split squats, because it actually improves the unilateral pelvic and hip control. And wide stance pause squats, because in that wide stance is going to challenge the hell out of your lateral hip stability. So with that, you're going to be able to train. And wide stance pause squat, I'm meaning that you want to go even wider than what you're normally doing. So for example, if you're squatting right now something like shoulder width apart, you want to go something like 1 to even 2 feet over that stance, so you can actually challenge your hips as much as possible into that movement. So you have more faith, your body has a little bit more faith in that position. So when you're actually getting back to your normal stance of squatting, you're already training those tissues under an even longer length. So with that, you're getting stronger, you're having a better stability, and your body will have more faith in actually putting the load on those tissues. If we're looking for accessories that actually help with pelvic control, but also with foot control, especially under the floor. So Copenhagen planks are great because it trains the adductor strength, but it trains the adductor strength under the pelvic control. So you have to kind of control the pelvis into that motion, and with that you're going to be able to actually directly transfer that into the squat. Hip abduction work, but also adduction work is going to work very well because you're training both of those movements, and you should be training them to some degree in some synchronicity in there. Just like, if you're training a lot of, let's say, back work, you want some, frontal plane to actually be trained too. So if you're doing a lot of extensions, but you're not really, doing too much ab work, that kind of turns into a little bit of a weak link, because you start to actually tilt your pelvis a little bit more, and you just do not have that ab strength to keep the pelvis back into position. Lateral step downs, single leg press. Again, it really helps you to actually root your feet into the platform and drive that through. And as I said, hip abduction and adduction work. Now, another very common breakdown is going to be the butt wing, or specifically loss of position in the bottom. Now, what happens with the butt wing is there can be a component of just not really having the, let's say, the mobility to get to depth, and because of that your body kind of has to release some of that stiffness, or in the first place you just do not really have the ability to be as stiff as possible with your torso to actually be able to get out of the bottom with force. So it's more so a compensatory issue in there, either because you do not have the mobility, and some people just do not really have the mobility to squat, ass to grass, and that's totally fine. Or you just do not have enough brace. You're not properly braced and you cannot really hold that brace, especially at the bottom. So that needs to be trained, because ideally what we want you to do in the squat is have the pelvis stacked to the rib cage. Okay. Any kind of deviation from that is going to shift the load from keeping the stiffness in there, so having a very strong cylinder around the abdominal wall, to actually shifting it a little bit more to your lumbar, a little bit more to your posterior chain, and that's where lumbar discomfort is actually coming from. So when we're looking at what's escaping the load, we have the brace itself. So the brace, your ability to brace is relatively poor. So you need to bring a little bit more attention in breathing and bracing, because those two are different components. Okay, so breathing is just bringing the air in, and bracing is that muscular ability to hold that pressure in. So you actually want to train that ability to really brace hard into that position. It can also be the adductors that are kind of trying to get away from the load, and it's actually being taken obviously by the lumbar. And this is usually happening because you cannot maintain that rigidity through deep flexion and compression. So when we're actually looking for variations and accessories, we have to look at variation and accessories that really help us to reinforce the rigidity of the torso. Because if we are rigid within the torso, it's going to be easier to actually transfer the force coming from the legs all the way to the barbell. If we have a poor ability to actually hold this tension in, that force will actually be dissipated. So you're going to start to actually lose stiffness, and that force will actually start to be moved to other tissues that shouldn't really have as much contribution in that position. But one thing to take under consideration, because I've kind of skipped one slide, not all butt wings are inherently dangerous. So if there is a little bit of a butt wing, that's totally fine, as long as you're not losing the center of mass and the weight is actually not being dumped forward. Small amounts can be normal. This is very dependent on your bony structures, how long your femur is, how long your tibia is, how long your torso is. For example, an individual that has a long femur and a relatively short torso is going to be pretty difficult for him to actually reach depth. So if for him, especially if he's competing in a competition, if for him he requires a little bit of loss of position just to actually hit depth, it is what it is. It needs to be done, and it needs to actually be accepted. You can get yourself, you can get strong in that position as you're actually training it. You can get, a very strong lumbar and hold position a lot better when you're actually getting out of the hole. As long as you can actually hold rigidity as much as possible in the hole, you should be fine. There is another component which is going to be mobility dependent. Maybe you can reach depth from a bony structure perspective, but you just do not really have the mobility. So that can be trained. That's easily trained by having variations and accessories that really target your ability to actually train mobility and be able to actually generate force and hold stiffness into that position. And with that, it's going to be easier to reach depth. Now, the real problem becomes when there is a loss of stiffness, a spontaneous, let's say, loss of stiffness. So you're in a really good position, you're going down, and just before actually reaching the bottom, you're relaxing everything, getting into deep bottom position. After that, getting out of position while rounding your spine. That is something that you should be watching out. And again, if we're looking for some variations, we need to reinforce that rigidity. And we can do that by post squats, because it's going to really challenge your ability at the bottom to hold that rigidity and really power through while holding that rigidity in there. Tempo squats, because you're going to have a lot more time under tension. And because you have more time under tension, you're proprioceptively starting to actually connect with your ability to brace. Anderson squats and pin squats, they're relatively similar, but there is a small difference in between them. So The Anderson squat specifically starts from a dead stop. So you're actually getting the bar on the pins and you're starting the movement from there, and you can pause a little bit longer in there. So being at, 2 to 3 seconds, 1 to 2 seconds at the bottom. The pin squats can actually be done by unracking the bar, and after that, just touching the pins and getting out of position. With this, it's going to be dependent on where the pins really are. If you're putting the pins just under depth, you're going to train your ability to actually hold stiffness even more than what you actually need to be at depth. So that's going to give you a lot more confidence to going down to do the squat and actually trusting your ability to stay stiff, because you've actually trained under that range. When you train it just at depth, because the pins are very different. Most probably not all of us can actually put the pins exactly at depth where we would actually reach depth, and we're not even very consistent with actually reaching depth. So if you want to train your ability to actually brace as much as possible, you want to be at depth or just slightly under depth, so you can train your ability to stay stiff into that position. You want to pause for like 2 to 3 seconds. Just above depth, in some circumstances, this can be a really good tool because you can overload it a little bit easier. So just over depth, you can go relatively heavier, and with relatively heavier, you're going to be more confident when you're actually handling maximum loads to hold that stiffness in there. But again, we need to sit into that position a little bit. Whether or not we're talking about the Anderson squat or whether or not we're talking about the pin squat, we want to sit into that position a little bit so we can actually train this component as much as possible. When we're looking at accessories, we want accessories that don't only challenge your ability to hold the brace and pretty much your ab strength and your back strength, but also your pelvis, because it comes hand in hand. Your ability for you to actually keep the pelvis stacked to the rib cage, but also your ability of the pelvis to actually stay in position as it actually reaches the bottom. So weighted planks are perfect for this. Back extension, because it actually improves your trunk endurance under load. Copenhagen planks, because it actually trains your ability to hold position with your pelvis. We already discussed about this on the knee valgus issue. Belt squats and deep split squats, because again, it actually trains your ability to hold tension, hold the stiffness under load, and you can go even further down in depth. So with the belt squat, you can use, for example, an extra plate over the platform, so you have a little bit more range of motion, and you can actually get very, very deep in there and try to focus as much as possible in holding your brace in there. So these are really good tools to address this issue. And probably the last breakdown that we're going to talk about is going to be the weight shift, the asymmetrical weight shift. This is very easy to identify. You just see someone that's actually dumping the load on one side. And that is because their body, or your body, if you're in this case, their body just doesn't really trust the other side. So there is either a strength deficit or a mobility deficit that's actually stopping the body from using the load and distributing the load in an equal manner. So what's happening in there, what's escaping the load, what's trying to actually escape the load is the adductors on the opposite side, the hip stabilizers on the opposite side, and the foot pressure on the opposite side. So these tissues and these positions are trying to shift everything back to the dominant side of the squat. And again, this is just a forced redistribution because one of the side is weak. So what we got to do obviously is get that side stronger and more mobile, so your body has the ability after that to really trust that side. So split squats specifically done with the barbell, like in this image right here, an excellent tool because you also have a specificity component in there. It actually trains your unilateral force production and pelvic control. You do not necessarily need to put more load on one side, to offset that. I've seen some protocols in which people are actually putting more load on one side, so it actually offsets it and it actually challenges exactly that side. You do not really need to do that, or just train the weak side. What's going to happen is you're already going to be under a deficit of strength on one side. So like the weak side is going to get tired faster, and you're going to be able to actually push that side to a closer to failure in terms of reps in reserve or RPE in comparison to the other side. So if you're doing something like the same number of repetitions, like 10 repetitions, the weak side might be something like 2 RIR, while the strong side might be at 4 RIR. So you're still getting more stimulus to that side. But with it, what you're actually doing is you're training both of the sides, but you're getting more stimulus on the side that's actually weaker. Tempo squat, another great tool, because it actually slows the compensations and improves positional awareness. So all that time under tension really helps you to really focus on that weak side in comparison to having your sleeves on and just being more efficient with or depending on the stretch reflex. You're actually having a lot of time under tension. You have to be aware of your positions. The pause squat, because it actually reinforces the symmetrical positioning under load. So you are in that pause, just like with the tempo squat, gives you a lot of time under tension, and you're bringing more awareness on that side. Head-filled squats allows focus positional correction with higher stability. What's really cool about the head-filled squat is the fact that you can voluntarily shift the load a little bit more on that weak side. So like you can focus a lot with the head fill because you have that extra stability component, and really shift a little bit of that load on that weak side. So you're getting as much stimulus on that side in comparison to the strong side, which already is strong enough. If it is so strong to the point in which most of the load is actually dumped on that side, that means that it doesn't really need as much stimulus. If we're looking for accessories, single leg press, Copenhagen planks, step downs, lateral step downs, single leg RDLs, and offset carries. Everything that's actually unilateral is going to be very helpful. The offset carries, you want to actually have it on the side that's actually strong. So the other side has to kind of work a little bit more in holding position. So for example, if you have, like in this image, if the weak side is the left side, and the strong side is the right side, you want to actually have the kettlebell or the dumbbell on the right side, on the strong side. So the left side is actually trying to stabilize the pelvis and your torso into position, while you have that, resistance on that side. So these are all really good. These are all, pretty much the most common breakdowns that you're actually going to find in the squat. But now that we've been going through them, we kind of have to create like an approach, a systematic approach about how we can actually identify them and how we can attack those weak points directly, choosing, again, narrowing down, isolating the tools that we should be using so we can actually better our squat. So obviously the first step is identifying the visible compensation. Okay, so what's actually compensating? What changed? What moved? What lost position? Okay, so you have a couple of examples in here. A visible change, torso collapse. What moved? The chest moved forward and the torso angle increased. Okay, what lost position? Stacked torso over the midfoot. Okay, so this is your first observation. This is where you actually see, okay, so what's going on? Where is the compensation? Once you actually have the compensation, you can start to look at leverages. Okay, so which moment arm increased, which moment arm decreased, which joint gained leverage, which joint lost leverage. Okay, so if we're looking at, again, the torso collapse, okay, we're going to see the hip moment arm being longer than the knee moment arm. Okay, so which joint gain leverage in this circumstance? Well, the joint that actually gain leverage is the knee. And which joint lost leverage? Well, it is the back, because everything has been actually shifted in there. The hip moment arm has increased. So now we know, okay, so the hip is actually working a lot more than the knee. And now we can identify the tissues that are escaping the load. Okay, so what tissues are no longer wanting the demand? Okay, what contribution has decreased? So hips shooting back, obviously, the quads are actually escaping the load. Okay, so the knee extension contribution has decreased and the hip extensors are actually taking over. So now, in understanding which tissues are escaping the load, we have to think about a rescue strategy. Okay, so what should we be doing in this case? If the quad is the one that's responsible for this breakdown, how can we change that? Well, we need to create a bigger knee moment arm, obviously, in comparison to the hip moment arm. And how do we do that? Well, that's where exercise selection comes into play. Okay, so we do not ask what exercise is cool, for this particular issue. We're actually looking what exercise restores the missing leverage, force production, or stability. Okay, so what exercise increases, in our case with the squat, increases our knee extension leverage, increases our knee extension moment arm. Well, obviously we're going to have to pick variations that actually forces the knee to actually go forward. So we have the front squat, the SSB squat. We have the belt squats as accessory. We have the pole squat, because with the pole squat we have a better contribution of actually letting the knee move forward. Tempo squat if needed, so you can actually have more proprioceptive feeling about pushing the knee forward. Heel elevated squats, so you can actually push the knee even further in front. So all those are really good tools that we can use as variations or as accessories to really target the quads. If we want more direct work, hack squat. If we want some other, let's say, accessories, getting the quads stronger just in general, like extension, it targets the shit out of your quads. So that's how you actually identify the exercise selection. Once you're actually understanding what's happening in there, what's breaking down, and which tissues are actually escaping the load, is going to be easier for you to really narrow down the tools that you need to actually succeed in getting your squat better. So the body always tells the truth. All you really need to do is to just understand its language. And now you are better equipped in doing so. So get at it, analyze your videos, analyze your clients' videos, see what is actually escaping the load. And with that, you're going to have a better approach and better decision in your programming. I hope this is helpful. I'm going to catch you on the next lesson. Have a good one.